We're gawking on sunshine as we wrap this comprehensive tour of the TV Boy's library. Thank you for your service, NES Works Gaiden episode 58. Seinfeld immortalized Frogger as an icon of video game history. And here we have Gakken's TV Boy adaptation of Frogger, which is definitely the George Costanza of Frogger ports. This is a Frogger port that shamelessly eats eclairs out of the garbage and builds a secret cubbyhole in its desk at work for the sake of sleeping on the job. It's a port that expresses nothing but elation when its fiancée died. What I'm saying is that Frogger for Gakken TV Boy is really not good at all. Frogger doesn't seem like a difficult game to handle well, yet Gakken absolutely just did not manage to pull it off here. Hilariously, this is by far the most expensive game for this system. The entire system's library probably falls under the heading of rare, given how briefly the TV Boy existed at retail, and I can speak from experience that putting together a complete TV Boy collection can be a whole lot more difficult than you might expect for a console with a grand total of 6 games. Yet somehow this one title comes up for sale less frequently than any of its 5 siblings. And when it does actually appear for sale, it sells for several times the value of its TV Boy counterparts. It might actually be the single most expensive aftermarket release of Frogger, barring Gufo-Wada-graded investment copies of the 2600 version that have been slabbed in acrylic by speculators and will never actually sell. It's that classic video game delta of bad and expensive that makes collecting such a sucker's game. In a way, you could almost call Frogger for TV Boy the platonic representative of video game collecting, the horrible little poster child. So, let's talk about Frogger, an all-time video gaming classic. Manufactured and distributed in the US under the aegis of the Sega Gremlin duo, the game actually originally hailed from Konami. In fact, the Konami brand appears attached to this version, since Gakken only published its game in Japan, where Sega never, to my knowledge, entered the Frogger picture at all. Frogger presented players with a simple but remarkably challenging task: get to the other side. It's like someone took the old joke about the chicken crossing the road and turned the punchline into a harrowing action movie. Frogger's protagonist begins at the bottom of the screen and needs to make his way to the top, crossing a highway and a river in order to navigate safely to his little frog house. Not 1, but 5 times in total. In theory, this task could take as little as 12 hops per journey, as both the freeway and the water are each 5 tiles wide. That is, the distance Frogger can move with a single leap. In practice, the simple task of traversing this single space is fraught with a wide variety of perils. For starters, you need to make your way through the most nonsensical traffic pattern of all time in order to clear the 5-lane highway. The traffic in each lane runs in the opposite direction to the lane next to it, meaning that the entire thing amounts to a deadly crisscross of recklessness. The traffic in each lane moves at its own speed, too, with variable gaps between vehicles. In order to get Frogger to the other side, comedy chicken style, the player has to predict the necessary openings in the bizarre automotive pattern. Thankfully, Frogger expands on the fundamental of Atari's Space Race, as seen in Epoch's Galaxian, by allowing you to move laterally, and even in reverse, rather than forcing you to maneuver straight upward. So you can slip in between cars and move alongside traffic, waiting for the perfect moment to leap ahead to the next lane, or even falling back a lane or two to wait for a more advantageous situation. But clearing the road hazards is really the easy part. Surviving on the water demands far more skill and foresight. Not unlike the roadway hazards, the river contains 5 vertical lines of objects moving at cross purposes. In this case, however, you want to touch the objects, as poor Frogger has forgotten what it means to be an amphibian, and will drown if he falls into the water. So you need to ford the river by leaping across logs and turtles until you can nestle yourself securely in your 5 little froggy homes. To add even more complexity to this process, new gameplay elements emerge in this phase. For starters, the turtles turn out to be treacherous bastards who plot against non-reptilian creatures. They like to submerge and resurface every few seconds, offering a brief but unreliable platform for riding across the water. To make matters worse, the logs and turtles streak past at different rates, which means that trying to maneuver over to the far left frog house in particular involves a degree of nerve-wracking risk. And you can't be certain that it'll be a truly safe harbor. From time to time, an alligator will pop up randomly in the empty frog houses, which feels like the game is breaking some sort of covenant of trust. Gators will sometimes appear in place of a log, too. Unless you think you can count on the median between the highway and the river to remain a safe haven in which to pause a moment and catch your breath, a deadly snake will occasionally zip past to devour any hapless frogs it happens to encounter. On the plus side, Frogger does offer a few bonus opportunities. Sometimes a fly will appear in an empty frog house, meaning that you can enjoy a bed and breakfast experience if you manage to zip into that space while the fly remains. And every once in a while, a pink lady frog will appear in the river. Escort her home, like the chivalrous little guy you are, and you'll earn ample bonus points. For the most part, these details come through in the TV Boy version of Frogger. The basic gameplay translates over recognizably, and you have to deal with the various logistics, navigating crisscrossing streams of traffic that zip past at different speeds, the randomized hazards and bonuses, and the tricky task of nudging your little frog into its destinations. But as you should probably expect from the TV Boy, Frogger doesn't exactly make the leap to the platform unscathed. Despite the arcade version's rudimentary visuals, barely more than pixel sketches, this console reduces the graphical detail even further into nebulous blobs of color that require a certain degree of familiarity with the source material for your eyes to parse clearly. More crucially, the shift from the arcade game's full resolution to the low-detail TV Boy hardware means that 4 lines of highway and river traffic have simply disappeared here. Rather than consisting of 5 lanes of action apiece, the roadway and waterway now contain only 3 lanes each. Although this might seem as though it would simplify the challenge, that's really only true for the highway. Once you reach the water, Frogger actually becomes more difficult when you have fewer moving objects to work with. Because the water phase of the game involves so many dynamic and randomized elements, including the gator surprises and the dunking turtles, you really need the ability to duck back a lane or two in order to evade sudden dangers and position yourself to dodge hazards. By removing nearly half of your fallback positions, Frogger on TV Boy ratchets up the challenge level considerably over that of the arcade game. Frogger is a fairly tough game, thanks in large part to the challenge of slipping safely into the frog houses at the extremes of the river, but that task is even more difficult here. I feel like it should go without saying that the TV Boy's stiff, cumbersome control lever ups the challenge level even more by turning Frogger into a blundering act that combines the need for violent force and pure luck, especially when trying to line up your poor frog into its home destinations while leaping off of objects that don't so much scroll as sputter past tile by tile. I certainly haven't played every port of Frogger to make its way to market, but this really does feel like the bottom of the barrel. It's recognizable as an arcade classic, but that doesn't make it something you'd necessarily ever want to play, and certainly not at its going rate. We end this journey through TV Boy history with the 6th game in the console's catalog, and the one that draws from the oldest source of inspiration. It may wear the name Shigaisen 200X-nen, but folks, this is just the tank mode of Atari's combat. This wasn't an official conversion though, so the new title, which means Urban Warfare in the year 2000X, makes more sense here than it did with the licensed adaptation of Super Cobra, especially since this doesn't attempt to recreate the entirety of Atari's combat, just the tank mode. Gakken was hardly the only developer to bite off Atari's seminal work, of course. Not too long before the TV Boy launched, Midway created a more visually elaborate combat tank clone for one of the minigame modes of its Tron film adaptations in arcades. And of course, Namco had Tank Battalion, the arcade game that formed the basis of its Famicom mainstay, Battle City. So really, Gakken stood in good company here. And by and large, I'd say that Shigaisen 200X-nen holds up as the strongest and most replayable original work for the TV Boy. That admittedly isn't a glorious feat to put on the old CV, given the meager size and miserable quality of the TV Boy library, but it still counts for something. Shigaisen puts players in command of a battle tank that has a whopping 2 abilities. It can roll around, and it can shoot. But in fairness, I think that's all anyone really expects from a tank. Your tank rolls around a battlefield that consists of narrow corridors that run between and around a 3x3 grid of blocks, which is patrolled by a handful of enemy war machines. In the first stage, you need only contend with a single other tank and a helicopter, but each new level adds another enemy to the mix until you have to endure 3 enemy tanks in addition to the chopper. Thankfully, Shigaisen arms you for this task by giving you a radical power seen nowhere else in the TV Boy library: the ability to fire at diagonals. One of the system's action buttons fires straight ahead in the direction you happen to be facing, while the other button fires a shot at a 45-degree angle. This matters because, as in Combat and Tron, your projectiles can reflect off the walls. When you fire at 90-degree angles, that ability doesn't really make much difference, but shoot on a diagonal, and your shell will bounce around the maze, angling down corridors and potentially hitting foes well out of your standard range. Learning to exploit the precise directional physics of the bank shots is the key to survival here. By angling your attacks around corners, you can steer clear of the enemy tank's range while picking them off through ballistic mathematics. Another victory for science. Of course, you still need to be wary of the helicopter, which can fly right over the barriers and gun you down wherever you happen to be, even firing at 45-degree angles. Shigaisen requires you to stay on your toes and play cat and mouse with enemy tanks while trying to remain out of the chopper's direct line of fire. Every few rounds, you have to survive a sort of deathmatch level, which removes the barrier grid from the stage and turns the whole thing into a free-for-all arena. You against 4 enemy fighters with no walls or blockades to rely on. The only advantage you have here is a human brain, which admittedly is less of an advantage for some people than others, and the fact that your shells fly about twice as fast as those fired by the bad guys. As a game, Shigaisen is totally simple and, as you'd expect for anything on TV Boy, fairly primitive. But it's compelling all the same. This brief, ill-fated console doesn't have a legacy to speak of, and to be honest, it's probably best forgotten about altogether. But Shigaisen 200X-nen isn't the worst final note, all things considered. And that's it, another console library in the bag. Thanks again to Christa for modding my TV Boy for this thankless task, and to Seth Robinson for helping me to complete the library. Next time? There is no next time. TV Boy is done. Go on, get on home.